Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Hey, everybody. Super excited today to welcome Steve Rosen. He is a veteran rock journalist. I mean, seriously, this guy has covered everyone from Prince to Jeff Beck to Eddie Van Halen, and that's who he's going to be talking about today. He wrote a book about Edward Van Halen. I like to say Eddie for some reason, but it is called Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, My 26-Year Journey with Edward Van Halen. And he has quite a unique friendship with him, and it documents his friendship through the Twilight tapes. You're going to have to check this out. Go to tonechaserbook.com. Of course, you can get it everywhere you can buy books. But welcome, Steve. How are you?
Thank you, Lisa. I'm doing great. How are you doing out there?
Doing good today in Lubbock, Texas, the land of Buddy Holly. How about that? So, hey, we got to bring in the other guitarists in the world, right?
Very cool. Absolutely. Yeah. One or two guitar players have come from Texas, I believe, for sure.
Yeah, just a few, right? I think it's a big state, so there's a lot of room for them.
This is true.
Yeah, but now this is so cool. So you're based out of LA area, which is where I was born, but not raised, and definitely in the hotbed of what was happening in music in the 70s, and got to experience so much. I'm jealous, right? Just totally jealous. I'm allowed to be a little bit jealous, and because it's like a little too late for me to go back into that time. I was a little kid then, but you got to see so many greats, including Eddie Van Halen. But I find very interesting in Tonechaser how you met him was at a Cheap Trick concert, right? And you didn't actually meet him going to write about him and seeing his performance.
No, it was. I'm not a big believer in destiny or serendipity, but a lot of components came together that night for me to be in the same place as Edward. So this is June or July, I can't remember exactly, 1977. Van Halen had signed their deal with Warner Brothers, but that record would not be released for 8 more months until February 78. Van Halen had been playing all around LA. They had sort of made their way out of their local Pasadena. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And they were playing the Strip, they were playing the Whiskey, the Starwood. And I was a habitué of those clubs all the time. For some weird reason, I had never seen Van Halen perform. So I'm there at the Whiskey that night. Cheap Trick is recording a live record. I was a big Cheap Trick fan, and I thought, yeah, that's worth checking out. Cheap Trick and at the Whiskey, that's cool. So I'm there with my brother and the girl who booked the club, Michelle Meyer, who was a good friend of mine. Michelle knew that I was kind of a guitar nut. I was always on the lookout for the next guitar guy. And Michelle knew everybody. I call her kind of this rock and roll yenta. She was just an amazing person. And she said, listen, there's somebody upstairs you need to meet. So we go upstairs to the Whiskey dressing room, and standing in the corner is this lanky guy with this amazing head of hair, and he's smoking a cigarette, and we walk over, and she goes, Steve Rosen, Eddie Van Halen, Steve Rosen, and we start this conversation, and I can best describe the conversation as it felt like a conversation we had started sometime in the past, and we were just sort of continuing. It was just so comfortable, and we shared so many similarities. I mean, he was a huge Eric Clapton fan. I love Clapton. He loved Blackmore, Jeff Beck, and we just had this connection thing. And a lot of people would ask, well, when do you think your friendship started? And if I really think about it, I really believe that the kernel was sort of sown that night. So yeah, on an obscure night at the Whiskey in 1977, I meet this guy, Edward Van Halen. So
the Godhead, as Michelle put him, the Godhead.
Godhead. And when Michelle described him as that, as Steve Rosen, Edward Van Halen, Godhead, Ed smiled. Ed knew what that meant. He knew Michelle, and he knew being described as Godhead was, sort of the elite of the elite. I mean, you were on Mount Olympus by yourself if Michelle described you as Godhead.
Well, I think what's interesting is the relationship between you both is because I think why it can start so well and so comfy like that is that you're definitely into music. And when, like, I know even just doing interviews that, because I've got a background in music, performed, had a band, all of that, and a musician will relax a little bit as soon as he knows, oh, you know what it's like, And yeah, we've had the band I mean, our band broke up on stage and it was such an epic band breakup drama that the audience thought it was part of the show. That's so the musicians will lighten up a little bit, but when they understand that you really care about every note, I think they get it. And when they understand that, then it's like someone to talk to that has a listening ear, not just one that's on stage, but actually has a true listening ear. Do you think that's part of your success as not only a rock journalist, but really focusing on guitarists?
I really do believe that's the truth, Lisa. From the beginning, I mean, I was a guitar player. I played in little local bands. I love to read. I love to write, and music journalism was a way to bring that all together. And I think what I brought to that as an interviewer was that ability to understand exactly what that guitar player was talking about when he talked about being in the studio, man, and he can't quite get the solo right, or talking about a songwriting uh, thing, and he, how he would build the chorus or the harmonies. I understood all of that. I was nowhere near as good as any of these guys I was interviewing, but I understood everything they said. And as you said, I understood every note, and so I believe that, yes, Edward recognized that. And I think all these other guitar players, I mean, I'd written for literally 50 years and I probably interviewed, I don't know, 2,000 guitar players, bass players, but, and inevitably it was always that thing where I'd be talking with them, and it really happened with Edward in that first conversation, where we're talking and it's kind of interviewer, interviewee, and hey Joe Perry, when did you start playing? And then I'll make some reference to a song and some inside thing about, oh man, that was a cool little lick you played, going into the outro or something. And I could feel it. It would shift from interviewer, interviewee to like, wow, this guy Rosen, he really knows, and now we can really have a conversation.
Yeah.
And those moments happen. So yes, I think that's what I brought. I was a really good writer. I was a very good writer.
Mm-hmm. But you are a good writer. I'm enjoying the book. I'm not all the way finished, but I think
I appreciate
it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say you're good because you have this balance of letting the person be them, especially in this book, right? You're documenting these conversations between you and Eddie, but at the same time you're humble to them, and at the same time strong as an individual, which is important. So yeah, you are a good writer.
Absolutely, and that was a tough tightrope to walk, because look, I'm sitting there with Edward, even though I knew him for many, many, many years. I was never complacent to the fact that I am sitting in the same room with arguably the most important guitar player to come along since, I don't know, name it, Jimi Hendrix, Clapton, Jeff Beck. I mean, I never lost sight of that. But on the other side of that, I realized that Edward didn't like being treated with kid gloves. If I, excuse me, I apologize. If I told him, Ed, great solo, amazing solo, he would almost get peeved by it. He didn't need to hear that. He knew that he was a great guitar player. He never needed to say it. And he just didn't need to hear it. So I always tried to keep that balance of sort of, when we were doing interviews, friend, interviewer, recognizing who he was, recognizing these special things he did, but without becoming the kind of the sycophant and just kind of drooling all over myself. It was a hard thing to do. I mean that kind of talent, and I've been around unbelievably talented people, but again, that kind of talent comes around once in a generation. So
it's amazing too, because I think also the vast experience you have, and then him also recognizing that you know all these guitarists, and Rory Gallagher, sorry, but I think he's still one of the best on the planet, and he was gone too soon.
Absolutely.
And whenever it's like, when it was one of the first things I read about you writing about Rory Gallagher, I'm like, yes. someone finally remembers who he is, and just there's this thing about actually understanding all these musicians, truly listening to their craft, because you can't write about it. And you make note about this in the book about how do you write about music to get people to feel the music, to actually go, you know what I mean? It's really hard because you can't duplicate the sound of what they've done. And so that's a really hard thing. It's the same thing food writers have. How many times are you going to say delicious? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that's an interesting point. And so when Edward was playing, so Edward would come over to my place in the Hollywood Hills, my little guest house, and he'd pick up my guitar and he'd start noodling, and I'm watching him. And then all those years later, when I'm writing a book, I go, how do I put somebody in my little front room sitting on the couch next to Edward, So I really tried to go into detail about what Ed was doing and how he was holding the pick and how the guitar was resting in his lap and how the cigarette smoke was coming, and I really tried to go into that. And I also did that by another little device that I used called Note. So in the book, there's these little sections called Note. And the person who is sort of describing what is happening in this note section is this big omniscient person. So he's looking down at Steve Rosen and Eddie Van Halen, but this guy knows everything. So he can look down there and he can describe in even more detail, what Steve Rosen is saying and all of those things. On the other side of that, he can look down there and go, Rosen, that was the stupidest question I've ever heard anybody ask. How could you ask Edward Van Halen that question, So this is like this big, eye in the sky guy, kind of keeping an eye on me. But yes, you're right. Trying to describe to somebody in words what Edward was doing musically was a tough thing. And I actually write what I wanted the book to be. I wanted the book to be like one long guitar solo. I wanted the book to sort of move you in a text way, the same way that Edward's guitar playing did. I wanted it to be at that level. So, yeah.
You're a sounding board for him, and you call it the Twilight tapes of recording. And he did want you to write a book, but then was like, getting away from that for a while. And so it's beautiful that you can do this, after his passing. Here's something for fans to enjoy. With his blessing, though, he wasn't, it was a weird time in between, right, for him wanting that, and you getting the cojones to finally go, okay, dude, we need to do this. You know what I mean? But he did actually sign and say, yes, let's do it. And but later got kind of shy about it. But these Twilight tapes, it's like you're like a sounding board. And how many of us have those midnight calls with friends, and especially back in the day, it's like sometimes I'm really grateful that I have friends overseas, though they may not like my conversations when they're having cornflakes and something. But these Twilight calls, I think, back in the day of recording even on cassette, it's got that warm vibe. It's like vinyl versus what we have now with streaming, right? I always thought tape was always, I love the warbly part, and that you have that. So it's really his words, but you're like his sounding board, and it's almost like he knows that he can talk to you about different things, and you have this knowledge of listening to other musicians too. Whereas now musicians can go to YouTube and Google, and but it's not the same as having someone's insight, that warmth. So you know what I mean? It's like Google is like the streaming versus the vinyl, if that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. I mean, obviously the computer is a remarkable tool. The internet, for me as a journalist to be able to look up, some guy talks about, the spelling of something. Back in the day, I sort of guessed what that was, and now I can go look for that stuff. In that respect, it's amazing. In terms of what it's done to the sort of the mystique and the allure of musicians, yeah, you're right. Now I can go on YouTube. I can see 10,000 videos of Zeppelin, and there's interviews with him, but none of them were sort of from back in the day. And it honestly, it's like the more I know about these people, the less interested I am. It's like I want that mystery there. And going back to what you're saying, yeah, everything was recorded on cassette, and a lot of these tapes are like, my God, over 40 years old, and thank goodness the the tapes didn't disintegrate. But yeah, Ed would call, you know, and they're called the Twilight Tapes because he'd call me at 2 or 3 in the morning and he wanted to talk. You know, there were conversations that I didn't record that I so wish I did, but I did record a lot of them. And as you described it, Lisa, you know, you described me as sort of a blessing to fans, you know, because when I'm, you know, when I'm working on the book and I'm listening to those tapes, and there were some pretty personal moments in there, I'm thinking, my God, do I talk about that in the book? Do I put that out there? You know, are people going to come screaming at me, which is the last thing I wanted? You know, are real fans going to think, you know, it's Rosen, what, you know, it's just a gossip. But I realized that it was those moments, it was those Twilight tapes, as much as anything, that revealed so much about him, because we weren't really talking about music per se. We're talking about this guy as a human being. And a lot of people describe those tapes as humanizing him, which is exactly what I wanted to do. So at the end of the day, yes, I included those. You know, I think people have understood that they are really a positive, a light that I'm trying to shine on him, that he was this human being and he had these frailties like everybody else. At the same time, I shine that light on myself, you know, and I'm in there, you know, doing coke with Ed and getting drunk, and you know, just tried to be as transparent as I possibly could. Yeah, it was I was lucky. I was lucky, and the 2 words, trust and respect. I mean, I had that from him from the moment I met him, and he had that for me. And you know, without that, I mean, none of this book happens. The relationship never happens, I believe. So
Yeah, and you were working on this book while he was alive, and when he first gave you the go ahead, and you'd already written a gazillion, you know, articles for magazines with him, but with his blessing, obviously, and had that trust. And that's kind of rare between a journalist and a musician, or, you know, their subject, because it's like, don't tell them this, don't let it, you know, they're hiding stuff, right? Which is important too, you know, people's human life, right? So there's that balance. But you are going to other people to get this information and get their stories, but yet you're sitting with gold this whole time, but at the same time going, yeah, you have to have that, not abuse his trust even though he's passed on, and also for the fans to also have that line of understanding. And at the same time, there's got to be a little bit of fear you had actually publishing this and getting it out there. Did you kind of like, okay, here we go, it's out there now, holy crap, what do I do?
oh man, that is absolutely the truth. So I sit in my little room up in my little Hollywood Hills guest house, excuse me, for 14 months. At the end of 14 months, I have this 580-page book. And, you know, until you put that out there in the world, just like a musician, you know, he's recorded his last record, and, you know, until it goes out in the world, he can believe he's just written, you know, the next Sergeant Pepper's. But until it goes out there in the world and you get the reaction from fans, because that's what it's all about. You don't make music, at least I think most musicians don't, for themselves. They're making it for the world to hear. You know, you can be Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck. You know, so before I put that book out there, I'm thinking, well, I wrote a good book. You know, I mean, I could believe I was, you know, John Steinbeck before it goes out there into the world. But yes, now it goes out there, you know, and fans have it in their hands. And again, man, I was really conscious of putting all that stuff in there. And what have I done? Have I tarnished the Van Halen legacy? I mean, my God, this guy, you know, and all the things he did. And, but at the end of the day, I believe that I'd written something really honest and positive, and I really believe that fans would react that way. And they have. Honestly, I don't think there's been maybe one negative response. You know, some guy wrote, well, who's this? I don't know if I can curse here. Can I curse here?
That's up to you, man. We're still legal.
Okay, well, who's this fucking Rosen? Who does he think he is? You know,
yeah.
I mean, you know, that the fact that he didn't know me or know that I had known Ed for all those years, that's one thing. But other than that, it's not like people were saying, God, why did you write that? That, you know, we think so differently of Edward. It was the other thing. And yes, again, just trying to humanize this guy. And
it's complex and complicated. you know,
Yeah.
and that's why I don't even, normally I'd say, oh, give us an anecdote, but I don't even want you to, because I want people to just read it from the beginning and get the full gist of it, and I think his wife, or ex-wife, Valerie Bertinelli, she went through that complexity stuff too. I mean, and it was a big deal. I remember when they broke up. And then, I think about Van Halen as a band too. Like, you got Sammy Hagar over here, you got David Lee Roth, and then isn't that also a big deal with fans fighting over those two? And I'm like, who gives a rat's ass? Listen to Eddie Van Halen. Who cares? Sorry, Sammy Hagar, but you know what I mean. And no offense to Sammy or David Lee Roth, they both have their own qualities. Let's put it that way. But um, it was called Van Halen, wasn't it?
Exactly. Exactly. But you bring up interesting points. Edward expected from the band members all of the loyalty and hard work that he put in. Look, Ed would be out in his studio, working on stuff, working on guitar bits. I mean, literally 24 hours a day. I would go over there and we would be up until 6 in the morning, hanging out and, getting high. And I'd go home and I have no doubt that he was still out there. He worked until the mid-afternoon, maybe go into sleep a couple hours. So the thing is, yes, his name was was the name of the band. But beyond expecting and really wanting that input from the other members, and that's kind of what led ultimately to sort of those riffs with Michael Anthony. And Mike was a wonderful guy, but Ed wanted more from him. Ed wanted more from Dave. Ed wanted more from Sammy. That ultimately resulted in those the splinterings. But in other ways, Edward was pretty passive, believe it or not. He really didn't, when managers were brought in, I don't think he had a big say. And he actually sort of found Sammy, the famous story, they shared the same mechanic. So it's not like Ed went out there to, purposely, I've got to go find this singer, to replace Dave. In fact, he had asked me, hey, go find me a singer. And I thought he was joking. It's like Edward Van Halen can't find a singer. It's not that he couldn't find a singer. I think that for Ed the idea, the mechanics of finding a singer or making calls or setting up auditions, it just wasn't how he was wired. So in many ways, he was pretty passive. He put up with a lot from Dave in terms of attitude and all that stuff. And I'm not saying Dave wasn't amazing and wasn't an integral part of Van Halen, but Dave did a lot of things, and Edward took them, I mean, there were problems with Dave and, those things, they showed up like almost at the beginning of the band. But
yeah, I think there's a balance that happens in a band of ego and where to leave your ego at the door. And are you doing it for the music or the showmanship? And I think when you're truly great at it, like you're letting the music be its integrity. And it's really hard when all this other crap starts coming in. And managers are part of that. Record labels are part of it. So many layers of what actually makes an album, no one sees that. That's why there's grooves in a record, because that's what the musicians go through.
Exactly.
There's so many little grooves of getting to the actual final piece. It's huge. And I think that's an important part of what you've written too, is to humanize. There's these giant figures, right? Like Eddie Van Halen, Rory Gallagher, Jeff Beck, God, man, I'm still bummed about Jeff Beck, man. I'm still just like, dude, no way. But you've got to think about their sweat equity into this and their integrity, because I think that whenever you're in the creative arts, even as journalists, right, isn't integrity probably one of the most key things to putting something out there and producing something?
No, absolutely. And just talking about myself real quickly, I had done those interviews with Edward for Guitar World back in the day. That's when I was going to work on originally the first book that you spoke about, that I was going to write Edward's authorized biography. He never, obviously that book never happened. But those articles I did really provided kind of a provenance for me. I mean, people read those interviews, and they were important interviews in the history and development of Edward. And so years later, when I did the book, I think people, they had read those stories and they go, oh, that's Steve Rosen. He had written those stories, we know those interviews. So you talk about integrity, and so critical. The thing with Ed, if Ed had never landed the big record deal, Ed would still be playing in clubs. I mean, that's what he did. He was just a guitar player. And I think he wanted everybody around him to have that same ethic, to believe that it was all about the artistry and the music. And look, all of the, the trappings and the houses and the money, will come later. I don't think a lot of guys thought that way. And when Edward was confronted with that, Dave going off or not being available to record stuff, and Dave was off on a vacation, Ed takes that as disrespect. Like, I'm here doing it. Dave is part of this band. Why isn't he here doing it? And yeah, that was huge with him.
The trappings. I love that word. That is so perfect. That's a perfect word for it, isn't it? Trappings. Used to be the trappings were like the glory pieces, right? It was like the trappings. It is. It's the golden, bird cage.
Absolutely.
Really.
Yeah, and I mean, if anybody has earned that, I mean, we're talking about Edward Van Halen, right? I mean, look at somebody like Rory Gallagher. Yeah. Unbelievable guitar player. Did he ever get all those trappings? I don't think so.
No, but he helped so many Irish musicians.
Absolutely. I'm not discrediting him at all.
Yeah. He was the man on he helped, didn't he, like help fund like guitar magazines, I think, in Ireland. Pat McManus was on a show a couple years ago and talking about Rory Gallagher and what he did for Irish musicians to get out and to be able to be seen and heard. Like, U2 wouldn't have made it if it wasn't for Rory Gallagher. Like, that's how good he was, to fellow musicians.
Yeah.
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
I could talk about Rory Gallagher all day. Let's go.
In fact, Neil Zlozower, Neil took the photos on the covers of the first two books and the back covers. Is a monster Rory Gallagher fan. He has like tons of Rory Gallagher bootlegs and stuff. And in fact, is the picture here? Sorry, I have a picture with Rory when I've interviewed Rory several times. And
well, now I'm really jealous, right? Now I'm really. Let's just call this the jealous conversation. No, I'm kidding, but I want to go to also the fact of the title of the book, Tonechaser. Explain that for people.
So I was looking for a title for a long time. As I'm writing the book, I'm trying to think of titles, and I had come up with a couple. I think one was something like A Time This Was, Eddie Van Halen. They're trying to be a little more poetic, and people go, I don't even know what that means. I go, all right, that's gone, Then I had one, Blood, Frets, and Beers. That sounds like a country album title, So I kept going through things, couldn't find anything. So literally, I think it was the last interview I ever did with Ed, which was in 2003 or the one just before that. So one of the very last ones. We're talking, and I can't remember what I asked him, and Ed says, "Yeah, man, I'm a tone chaser, always going up that elusive tone, And I said, "Are you still looking for it?" He goes, "Yeah, man, I'm still looking for it." And as soon as he said that word, I go, "Oh my God, that's amazing." And what was remarkable about the word, beyond the fact that it's such a beautiful word anyway, was for him to use that word to describe himself. Ed was not eloquent in that way. I mean, he was incredibly articulate and bright, but for him to use that word, Ed would have said, "Yeah, man, I just put, some new speakers in the Marshall cabs, or, I'm using the new Wolfgang guitar," whatever it is. He would speak in that kind of lexicon. But for him to say Tonechaser, and for him to describe it as elusive, I thought, oh my God, that is so amazing. Which is why that is sort of the little excerpt. A couple pages in the book, there's that wonderful Neil Zlozower photo of Edward kind of sitting there, looking a little bit pensive, and that's the description. You know, I'm a Tonechaser, man. I'm always looking for that elusive tone. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but yeah, I knew instantly that was it. It was,
How
so
was it going through the tapes and hearing his voice? That must have been difficult. I remember we lost our bass player, who was I also dated, you know, before the world of he needed to have kids and things, and I lost him. We all lost, you know, and we had worked on the band together real close and listened to just about everything. I mean, we were dissecting music, you know how that happens, and all of a sudden I could not play music for quite a few days. You know, it just became this like every song had some kind of connotation or something. And when I started reading, I was going, God, it must have been difficult, yet at the same time beautiful emotionally to go through these, to hear his voice and to go through these.
it was a pretty remarkable experience, Lisa. So yes, so I had all these interviews. I had all these cassettes. Some labeled. They were all labeled with Edward Van Halen. I knew they were Van Halen tapes, but for some dumb reason, there were no dates on them. So I had to
Well,
go.
it was the Twilight Calls.
I know, but God, I should have been more. So,
Yeah.
you know, so I listened to a tape and I go, well, when did this happen? And then we'd be talking and he'd say something and I go, oh my God, that's right. That was like right around 83. And I was up at Ed's house and, you know, so I kind of pieced it together. But yes, hearing his voice, because honestly, I haven't listened to those interviews since I did them or since those stories were written around them. It was pretty hard. It was pretty freaking hard. The only thing that made it even possible was the fact that 17 years had passed since I last spoke to him. So there was that gap, you know, that, you know, you kind of, you heal and stuff. And also the other part of that equation is, so I began the book on my birthday. I remember that August 24th, 2020. Edward passed away October 6th. So Ed passed away literally 6 weeks after I began the book. So now I'm thinking, oh my God, now what do I do? I think I was 3 or 4 chapters in, and it's like, are people really going to think I'm, you know, this is an insult to his legacy? Or, but you know, honestly, again, I felt that what I'd done was good, and so I just kept going. But yes, it was really hard, and there were moments, you know, when, you know, some of those, the Twilight tape specifically, those conversations where he was opening up and I was opening up, and it was Christmas and I was feeling really blue, and he was saying, hey man, it's okay. It's like, yeah, it was really hard. It was really hard. I'm just so thankful I had those tapes, and that early on he had said to me, hey man, record anything you want. You know, so thank goodness I had those tapes, and yeah, I think they're very rare and valuable insights into who this guy was. You know, I think
one of the best for sure.
Yeah,
one of the best. Who do you think is good now? Who do you listen to now of today?
Boy, that's a tough question.
Isn't it?
You know, I thought the Rival Sons were an amazing band. I loved them. Scott Holiday, man, he had like that old school kind of Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck thing. Honestly, Lisa, I don't listen to a lot of new stuff. For a while there, I was doing a lot of interviews with a lot of these metal guitar players for a site called Ultimate Guitar. So I was interviewing like the guys from a band called Periphery, Meshuggah, you know, these you know, hardcore metal, a lot of really good guitar players, but just not, it didn't move me in the way it would if I listened to a Rory Gallagher record, or, you know, a Cream record, or a Hendrix record. I mean, I really am from that era, or Procol Harum, or a Tull record, or a Spirit record. It's just a different thing. And again, I had vinyl. I had a huge, huge record collection that I write about in the book. I think I probably had 8,000 or 9,000 records. So to me, it was all about vinyl. And now, later listening to records on CD was impossibly hard. I could never listen to records online or as a stream. I thought that's not the way that these musicians meant it to sound. It's nothing like the way it was recorded, So I wish I could say, yeah, man, there's these amazing bands out now that I listen to. There are, you talk about the passing of Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck was the greatest guitar player who ever lived, in my estimation. I believe Edward was the most influential. I think that Jeff was the greatest guitar player.
And he helped people too. I think that was the other thing is Jeff Beck helped musicians and singers get some spotlight on, like Tal Buchenfeld, what he did for her.
Yeah.
I mean, you just think like, there's something about musicians that leave that open space, like you and Eddie, right? Have that open space, that connection that does give back more than their music. That does give back to those in that field, like what we were talking about with Rory Gallagher. Jeff Beck, definitely. He gave so much to so many musicians. It's yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to send you some links to some badass guitarists we've been interviewing lately that just feel so good. But you know what? It's I think it's because they're carrying they're original in them, but they're still carrying that torch from the past of sound and keeping some of the blues yet hard rock. If you can do that merge of, you have to have that bit of soul in there. I'm sorry. You can be as technical as you want, but if you have no soul, it just sucks.
Well, I agree. And there are a lot of guitar players out there on YouTube who have technique that is dazzling. But at the end of the day, it's like, okay.
It's that doesn't do anything. You have to have the dynamic. And if you can have dynamics that are technical, and that still sucks.
Exactly. The other side of that, that doesn't get talked about a lot, is Edward as songwriter. Because talk about these other guitar players, he has unbelievable technique, but maybe the compositions, maybe we've heard that before. So that's a rare thing when you can write and play, at that level that Edward did. So.
Oh, right on. Well, so now this book, Tonechaser, this is looking at going towards the third printing now?
Well, the second edition has been doing unbelievably well. This past weekend was extraordinary. I sold an amazing amount of books. I mean, I was so happy about that. So a third edition, maybe.
Hey, why not? Why not? Everyone, Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. Why do you call him Edward instead of Eddie? Before you go, I have to ask that. That was one of my...
The first time I met him, Michelle called him Eddie. But from the first time I called him or we spoke, he always said, "Hey, Steve, Edward, hey, it's Edward," So that's how he referred to himself. So typically when somebody refers to himself, that's the name they want to be called, And he always called me Steve. Typically I would have used Steven Rosen, but he called me Steve, so I used Steve. But Ed liked Edward. He didn't particularly like Ed or Eddie. He thought he sounded like a little kid, but he got used to that.
It's funny because he gave you his number when you met each other, and yet had he read any of your work and you listened to him, you know what I mean? So this was a genuine friendship just from a good conversation. A good conversation is worth so much. It really is.
It is. So. And I love that question, and I write about that specifically in the book. I don't think he ever read one word I ever wrote. I would have the magazine, of one of the Guitar World stories, and he's on the cover, and he'd kind of look at it, and I think he's going to open it up and flip. I mean, I think he loved the idea that I was a music journalist, but not because I had met all these guitar players. I think he just liked the idea I would like to believe that we still would have been friends had I been a librarian or a bank teller, you know. But yeah, no, I don't think he ever read anything I ever wrote. He read one thing, and it's a funny little anecdote. I went to a NAMM show with Edward in New Orleans. NAMM is the National Association of, well, you probably know, music
merchants of music. Yeah, you know, it's where all the musicians get together and buy stuff and represent stuff.
Together, all the guitar makers and drum makers bring their new stuff. People from guitar stores, excuse me, order stuff at the store. So I wrote this story, and I drove over to Edward's house that morning. We were going to take a flight to New Orleans. It's 8 a.m. He's got a can of beer in his hand. Ed was a split malt liquor drinker. In this story, I said, yeah, Ed had a can of split malt liquor, blue and gold. Somehow Ed saw that one line, or maybe I showed him this story in the magazine when it later came out, and he goes, no, that's not right. And I'm thinking, oh my God, the one thing he's read and he's not right, he doesn't like it, you know? He goes, no, he goes, the can was blue and silver. Yep. I said it was blue and gold. So that's what he responded to, not the fact that it was a story in a magazine or anything.
Oh my God, Schlitz. Oh my God, think about that. Yeah. It's still around, you know. That stuff has not gone away.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, and you know, those are the big cans. And
no, seriously, from our band days, speaking of our bass player, it was Foster's oil cans. And once in a blue moon, people look at me like I'm nuts, because here I am with a Foster's oil can, and I will drink it. And people just look at me like, what? I don't care. The Foster's oil can comes out. It's like a weird, not a guilty thing, because I really don't give a damn. It's just a thing. And it was like a weird, you know, it's like, we didn't have money. I was like, let's have our Fosters, you know? And it's the same kind of thing. And I remember a friend of ours, a major music person, would drink Schlitz, and we would laugh. We're like, we'd sit there with our Fosters and our Schlitz and go, you know, we're the happiest poor people on the planet.
Yeah, it's weird. Ed loved Schlitz.
Hey, that's it. Hey, each to their own, man. That's all good in the hood. Well, congratulations on getting the book done, because, you know, and from the first run to now second, going to the third, and excited for everyone to go get it. Everyone, Tonechaser, and they can go to tonechaserbook.com, because you actually sell them directly online. That's a novelty in itself.
Yeah, I didn't. I'm really technically, I'm a Luddite. I don't get it at all. I was lucky to even figure out how to put a book up on Amazon. I'd been on eBay. I saw guitar picks. But yeah, I just figured, hey, I've got my little site. Come there. You know, there's a lot of cool pictures and, you know, fun little stuff. So yeah, online.
Right on. And I got to give a shout out to our sponsors of the day, Steve and Karen Wilson. We call them Mr. and Mrs. Wild. They own a Victorian bed and breakfast, and they travel all over the place following music. And you talk about guitarists, they love guitarists, and their bed and breakfast is known as the Lion and the Rose Bed and Breakfast in Asheville, North Carolina. Great music city. A lot of good music. Hey, Warren Haynes comes from there. So, you know, talk about good musicians. Give him shout out. So if you go to Asheville, go to lion-rose.com and stay with them. It is not your grandma's bed and breakfast. I'm just saying. They do serve beer when you get there. He brews beer. Speaking of beer, he's going to yell at me later about Foster's and when they listen to this. But when you go in, ask for the Dirty Godiva beer. I'm just saying. All right. Thanks so much, Steve. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It was great. Had a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.